All right, thank you all for coming here and for watching the live stream. The first panel that we're going to do is going to explore the reasons why we have these funding and budget challenges. So we're going to have 4 panelists here. Each of them contributed a chapter to the book. They're going to do a presentation about the topic of their chapter. After that, we're going to talk about it, and then we're going to turn it over to questions from the audience. So think of your questions now and during the presentations. With that, I can introduce each of them. I'm going to go in order of the way they're going to present. So to my right is Adam Tyner. He works with me at Fordham as the Assistant Research Director. And he's going to explore all of the research on the connection between spending and outcomes. As Rick talked about, right, that's kind of obvious, which Adam will talk about, but there's a little bit more to it. To his right is Bryan Hassel. Bryan is the co-president of Public Impact. It's an education policy organization that focuses in part on education funding. He and his wife, Emily, who also is a co-president of Public Impact, they contributed a chapter on how school systems can rethink how they staff their schools and their systems to make dollars go farther. To his right is Karen Hawley-Miles. She's the Chief Executive Officer and President of Education Resource Strategies. They have done a lot with as many as 100 school systems. And for a number of these, they have a database of budget information. So they can draw a lot from that. And she will be talking about the specific challenges that districts and states with declining enrollment have in this environment. And finally, Nathan Levenson is the managing director of the district management group. He's authored multiple books on school finance by himself. Yeah, he's not just an editor. And so his chapter is about cost-effective special education, which is a particular challenge in this environment. So with that, Adam, you want to kick us off?
Sure, thanks, Brandon. Good morning. I don't think that today I have the most sophisticated argument to make, but I do think it may be the argument that you are most likely to remember. I address a simple question, and the answer is actually one word. There'll be a quiz, by the way, at the end. So see if you can remember the one-word answer. Let's see if I can even get this queued up. Oh, thanks. The question is, does money matter for schools? And the answer is, after Rick's introduction, I'm sure you'll be shocked, yes. Better school funding has a positive impact on student outcomes. We could end my presentation right there, but I'll just take a couple of minutes to explain how we got here and where I hope this conversation about the role of funding goes. First of all, I think it's been exaggerated that very many people ever claimed that money didn't matter to schools, although I do think that is the message a lot of people received. And although I suppose we can only speculate as to why this idea took root, we have to admit that it was a convenient message for people who didn't want to equitably fund schools. But generally, when raising doubts about whether spending was responsible for student learning, the claim was not that spending didn't matter, but that spending didn't matter as much as we expected, that spending didn't matter as much as other factors like family background, or that we shouldn't focus on spending and other inputs as much as we should focus on student learning and student outcomes. Those are all fair points. But unfortunately, the idea has been out there that spending doesn't make a difference to schools and students. And rhetorically, at least, I think the clearest argument that spending doesn't matter may come from a simple eye test when looking at a graph like this one. You'll see that there are 4 lines representing scores on the National Assessment of Educational Progress over time, and the thick black line represents per pupil spending. Spending skeptics point to graphs like this and say, look, spending is going up like crazy and test scores are pretty flat, therefore money isn't the problem. Now, most any researcher will tell you this is a terrible way to make a comparison, let alone a causal claim. It ignores all kinds of other things that are going on, but I think it sums up the rhetorical power of the spending doesn't matter crowd. But even in this analysis, most favorable to the contention that spending doesn't matter, we actually do observe a positive correlation. Those NAEP scores might not be going up as fast as spending, but they're still going up some. So while even the eye test does show a correlation between school spending and student outcomes, in recent years, numerous studies have utilized approaches that are far more methodologically sound. Using nearly experimental conditions is best we can do in social science to debunk the notion that there is no connection between school spending and student outcomes. I'll let you read my chapter if you want to get into the weeds of those debates, but these newer, more rigorous studies are numerous, and they have conclusively demonstrated, perhaps to the point of overkill, that better funded schools do indeed produce somewhat better students. Still, although we can know that better funding on average leads to better outcomes, we don't know by how much in each case, meaning that whether adding or lowering funding is the right choice in your district or any given district is a case-by-case decision. That's the one major caveat that I would make to this argument. For my last minute, I just want to make the argument that now that it is settled that school spending matters, researchers should redirect their efforts. Instead of spending energy on finding another clever way to show that school funding matters, which everyone should now agree is settled, school funding questions should largely be focused on what is sometimes called academic ROI, or academic return on investment. In my experience working with districts, there are a lot of questions about whether a program has a statistically significant effect, and unfortunately much less conversation about the magnitude of the effect, the per unit cost of that magnitude, or the opportunity cost. In other words, what alternatives might achieve that effect, but potentially at lower cost. It's critical that we start having those deeper conversations, and researchers and policymakers and advocates and funders should push in that direction. On the upside, those are exactly the questions that we're going to be discussing in depth the rest of the day and in this new book. For researchers, this means that I don't think we need another fancy regression discontinuity study to show that something that we already know. And for advocates, policymakers, educators, and everyone else, the literature on this topic makes it clear, as you'll see in my chapter, that poorer students are the ones who benefit the most from funding increases. And this underlines that we cannot ignore resource inequity, and we need to work to make sure that we sustain equalized funding where it's been realized and fight for it where it hasn't been. So, does school spending matter to student learning? Yes, you passed, at least a couple of you passed the quiz. Now that that's settled, let's move on to other questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Adam. Bryan?
That's my button.
Green means go.
I think so.
Green means go. Great. All right, I'm going to talk about rethinking school staffing. And so we all know how teachers feel when you start talking about stretching the school dollar or getting more bang for the education buck, right? This is it. And there's a good reason for that. I'm going to show you a couple of pictures that tell you why teachers would get nervous when we start talking about this topic. Here's the first one. Since 1970, as we just saw from Adam's slide, real per pupil spending has gone up 145%. So that's real spending after inflation. It's per pupil, so it accounts for the enrollment increase. During that same time, real average teacher salary has been basically flat. And it's actually worse than the picture shows because we know from surveys of teachers they're working more hours than they were in 1969, probably more than 7.5% more. And so teacher pay per hour has actually gone down over this time of rising spending. That's the first picture. Here's the second one. In 1969-70, teacher pay made up 50.8% of all the money that went into U.S. public education. 2015-16, teacher pay makes up 30.9%. So it went from being more than half of what we spent the money on and it went down to less than a third of what we put the money into. So if you're a teacher and you're seeing money being stretched or even increased, you're right to be concerned. It's not going to come into my pocket. That's not what we've done over the last 50 years. At the same time, teaching hasn't kept pace with other professions. It's not just about the money. It's also about what's the job like. If you look at teaching, teachers work largely alone. They have very little support from more advanced peers who can help them. They're really responsible by themselves from the first year of teaching for a set of students, whether that's 25 elementary students or 100 or 150 or 200 secondary students. The only way to advance and make more money is to leave teaching. And you don't get to your top pay until the average of about 55. And if you're an excellent teacher, you're not going to reach any more students than the average teacher or even a very low-performing teacher. And that stands in huge contrast to other professions where over the last 50 years, they've created an amazing career opportunity for talented people to work in teams, to get support every day from their peers, to advance while continuing to do the work they want to do, whether that's practicing law or medicine or what have you, getting to top pay earlier in their careers, and then being able to have more impact over their time. And this is linked to the money part because of the one teacher, one classroom setup where teachers are solely responsible for their kids, we've had to build this whole elaborate structure around them to try and support them, and it hasn't been very effective. If you look at all those increases in spending, a lot of it is adding aides, adding instructional coordinators, adding support staff of other kinds, adding administrators to make up for the fact that teachers are working alone in this structure. So if we want to move on to something different, it's got to be not just changing the dollar flow, it's got to be changing the profession and the way teaching works. And so that's what this rest of the chapter talks about, new models that could get us there. The one I've put up on the screen is the one that our organization, Public Impact, is working with schools to create, which is called opportunity culture. And this is an example of giving teachers who are great ways to take on new roles where they lead teams of other teachers and other professionals towards excellence, a grade level, a subject department in a middle school or a high school, where they can earn 20 or 50% more for doing that extra job. Teachers figure out how to do this within the existing budgets of their schools, and they also change their schedule, so they have time during the day to collaborate, lead, plan together, and so forth. This is one model. There are other emerging models of how schools can reorganize their resources and reorganize their time. But the theme of this one is putting more money in teachers' pockets and giving them a job that's more like the careers they might have in other professions. Ideally, that leads to better recruitment of teachers in the profession, better retention of teachers over time because they can stay and do the work that they want to do. And have a much richer career as part of the work. And in addition, it could pay off for students as well. In this work that I'm mentioning here, opportunity culture, we see high levels of teacher satisfaction, but we also see third-party research showing that when teachers join a team led by one of these great teachers, they move from having growth in about the 50th percentile of teachers up to the 75th to 85th percentile in math and nearly that high in reading. So there's a way in which this new structure isn't just good for teachers, but also helps students by giving more of them access to great teaching, which, as we know, is the #1 influence on their learning. I want to end by saying just a little bit about, how could you get towards something like this? It's 50 years or 100 years, or how long, Karen, 150 years in the making, the system that we have. How would you move to a new system, and what role could policymakers play in that? And I think states can play a particular role. One is to provide transition funding so that districts can plan and execute a transition to new models. You can't just snap your fingers and suddenly have a different organizational structure. It takes time, it takes effort. Districts could use funding to move in that direction. Moving towards a set of principles like this or something similar. #2, states could remove barriers to changing things in this way. There are lots of structures in the way budgets work, in the way staffing restrictions work, class size, rigidities, and other factors that make it hard to do some of these things. States could clear those away as long as schools are moving in this direction. And then finally, states could help gather data over time about how this is going in schools, learning what works well, what doesn't work as well, so that schools everywhere can move towards a model that's better for teachers, better for students, and ideally moves us back towards teachers' pay being half of what we spend the money on because it's more than half of the impact that we want to have on students. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bryan. Karen?
So I'm going to spend a little time talking about a challenge that about 40%, 45% of urban districts in large cities face, and about that same percent in small rural districts face this challenge, and that is declining enrollment. Depressing topic, maybe, but I was excited to take it on because like any pressure on cost or performance, it opens up an opportunity for re-envisioning what we're actually doing. And it creates an opportunity for a different kind of engagement with the community, both the school community and those in the community that are supporting it. And so I'm going to talk about strategies to do that. But first, I want to spend a minute on why it's such a problem. Because to those of you in the room, declining enrollment would seem obvious. But to the general public, being really clear about what the cost challenges are and the performance challenges that come with declining enrollment is important. So the first is that with every student lost, enrollment drops. The amount that enrollment drops depends on what state and district you're in and the finance mechanisms that are there, but it's something between 40 and 100% of per pupil spend in that district. The second reason is that costs come down a whole lot more slowly than that, if at all. Just take the example of a classroom teacher in a school that loses 5 students spread over the school. No opportunity to think differently about the number of teachers that are in that room if we use traditional models of organizing. Then the third set of reasons that are on this chart is really important and often not talked about. The first is that the average cost per student actually goes up, right? Because you're spreading fixed costs over a fewer number of students at the school level and at the district level. The second reason is that in many of these cases, the needier students are the ones that are still left in the district. But the finance mechanisms that exist don't compensate for that anywhere close to that amount. And we've documented this in a number of different cities around the country. And the last reason is that average teacher compensation goes up often in these cases. And that's because they're not hiring new teachers who make less and reduce the average teacher compensation costs. And in fact, they might be laying off teachers in reverse order of seniority, driving up the average cost of compensation. So these are the reasons important to understand and important to understand how they affect each district because the solutions you take on need to address those particular challenges. So I've outlined 5 strategies for doing things differently, but I want to spend just a minute talking about what districts typically do, which is they kick the can down the road. They do things like defer maintenance, dig into their reserves, do furloughs, and don't fill vacancies. Problem with this, it hurts the neediest students the most because those are the ones that are in the buildings that need fixing and have the vacancies and need the extra investment that could be funded by going into reserves. So what do we do instead? So I've outlined 5 strategies that try to do this like moment for engagement and innovation. I'm going to talk about 3 of them, not the central office one because that is the one that most folks go to first. Instead, I'm going to build off what Bryan shared with you about, is this an opportunity that we can use to re-envision the models that we use for delivering, to organize people, time, and money in schools. So this chart, which is a little bit hard to read, but there's all sorts of things on our website about it. Organizing for high performance, we've found, means organizing people, time, and money in schools in very different ways than we do, in different ways than regulations reinforce, and all of those things. It means using time, varying time and attention, and it means leveraging teacher expertise and teaming in really different ways. That's especially hard to do in subscale schools in declining enrollment districts. We've seen that districts spend about 20% more per student in these subscale schools, especially if they're organizing using traditional delivery models, if they don't bust up the way that they're organizing classrooms, providing electives, engaging in kind of after-school support, and those kinds of things. So the other thing we've learned is that school size, super important, grade size even more important. So if you have a grades fewer than 45 or 50 students in a grade, it makes it much harder to organize for extra time and attention, teacher teaming, all sorts of things, and to adjust class sizes to targeted levels and so on. Reconfiguring grades, the easier proposition than closing schools. thinking differently about what's the combination and nature of our schools, context specific, can be an exciting opportunity for districts that around the country, and we've worked with a lot of them to do that. So it's a moment to think differently about what's our vision for schools, and how do we, for what we want students and teachers to experience in schools, and how can we use this moment of disruption, often painful, to think differently about what we're doing and to engage the community. I do want to close by saying, I've been talking in kind of Pollyanna-ish terms about a declining enrollment, which is never a comfortable thing. And in many of the places where we're facing that, funding levels are too low. What I've seen with really talented and strategic leaders is they've used this moment both to be good stewards of the resources that are there and gain credibility by making tough and painful choices, but also to engage others in really deeply understanding what drives the budget, what are the components of the budget, and the need not just to be good stewards of the money, but to invest more, in fact, and raise more resources to do the work. So this combination of revisioning lets people talk about their vision and the need for investment at the same time that it lets them prove their diligence in being good stewards of the resources.
Thank you, Karen. Nate?
Great, thanks. So if talking about declining enrollment is difficult, let's shift to something much easier, special education. So I want to talk about cost-effective special education that can be good for the budget and great for kids. And let's just set the pace and set the ground rules. Kids with disabilities deserve better. So I don't want to debate that or discuss that. No matter how you look at the data, no matter how you look at life outcomes, this is a group of kids that we are leaving behind. That said, we need to also get comfortable with the second thing that I believe to be true, and that historically more spending hasn't helped them a whole lot in the past, and therefore simply spending more, and I'm not saying we shouldn't spend more, but simply spending more of doing slightly more of the same is really, really unlikely to change the first statement that kids with disabilities deserve better, not just more. I think the path forward has to be shifting this conversation, shifting the way we talk about special education, and stop asking this question, are we spending too much or too little? And start asking, are we getting enough outcomes, enough bang for the buck when it comes to the money that's being spent? And then if we're going to try to answer that question of what do we do differently with the dollars we have, the same or more, the chapter outlines a number of options. I want to talk about 3 today. The first seems so obvious, I feel embarrassed sharing with a group of really, really smart people that we should simply spend the dollars we have on things that work. But I am going to talk to you about that. We also should know what things cost in far greater detail. And then lastly, we're going to need to rethink how we manage and lead special education if we're going to be able to do the first couple. We are awash in research. And after about 20 years, it is between the National Reading Panel, What Works Clearinghouse, John Hattie's work, NEEKC, all the great things Fordham and American Enterprise Institute puts out, we actually know what works. And this is not a radical list of, hey, core instruction really matters, and a focus on reading is really important, and some kids are going to need more time to learn than others, that teachers matter a lot, and they should actually have deep content expertise. If you're trying to teach a subject, you should know it, and clearly we've got to address social and emotional needs. Not radical. I think a lot of people refer to as common sense. But having looked deeply at about 125 school districts and how they serve kids with disabilities, while they may say this is common sense, it is not common practice. Vastly fewer than, I would say about 10% of the districts we work with do all of these, and certainly no more than 50% do even some of these best practices. So the first big issue is if we've got limited dollars and we've got kids with great need, we have to shift our practices to the things we know that work. And for a long historic reason, special education has went down a path that really focused on more adults, less expertise, more paraprofessionals, fewer teachers. That has risen, costs go up, but learning hasn't. The second thing we got to do is actually know what things cost. If we want to be cost effective, we should know what things cost. And generally people think about special education spending in the whole. Whoa, the budget is 22% for special education. It used to be 21%. We are fairly cognizant of how much we spend in total. But when I work with districts, I say, hey, look, you've got a teacher. Makes about $75,000 a year. One strategy costs $5,000 a student, the other less than $2,000. At least raises the question, is the more expensive one more effective? In this particular example, no. There's a lot more learning and a lot more growth, and it happens to cost a lot less. And then lastly, if we're going to implement what works and we're going to do it cost effectively, we've got to rethink the entire leadership and management of special education. Being a special education certified person doesn't actually mean I know how to do everything that needs to be done. And we're going to have to ask others, general education leaders, teachers, head of teaching and learning, to step up and play a much bigger role in the lives of kids with disabilities. And this is really a rethinking of central office, or rethinking of roles and responsibilities at the site level. And then if we're going to do the things that work and do it cost effectively, we're going to have to organize our districts differently as well. None of this will come easily, but the kids really, really need a vastly different and better life trajectory, and this can help them get there.
Thank you. All great stuff. We're going to sort of talk about it all now. So obviously the policy world is sort of awash in great ideas, often backed by studies and things like that. But the hardest part, right, is taking those ideas and actually implementing them, and then implementing them well. First getting the buy-in and then actually doing it well. And the environment here is just so challenging. Rick talked about this a bit. Based on what Adam said, right, you have this sort of very easy to understand conclusion that, look, more money leads to better outcomes. So let's get more money, right? Which is what you hear from school systems or a union so often, right? But obviously that's not always doable. The public's opinion in terms of whether funding should go up is actually complicated. So Nate and Bryan, both of your chapters and both of what you talked about, right, is sort of at the heart of those chapters is that there's something wrong happening. There's a bad approach to staffing and special education, and we need to fix that. The difficult thing, I think, and Karen, I'm going to talk about your stuff separately because I think it's a little bit different. There is like a very easy to understand problem in these places with declining enrollment. But for Nate and Bryan, in a time where sort of spending is consistently recovering from the recession, how do you get buy-in in states, in a school district, to actually make these changes, which are often difficult, right? Bryan, you talk about changing the way that teachers teach and going from like one teacher in front of a classroom thing to a team of teachers and paying different teachers more based on how effective they are. Like all of these things are difficult, especially in places with a union and things like that. And obviously with the special education community, right, they have very powerful advocates for good reason. So in these places, how do you actually get these changes to happen? Bryan, let's start with you.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a big challenge, and it's not just an idle challenge. If we don't figure it out, we'll fail, and I think you can see that in a lot of efforts that have happened in the past 10 or 15 years, where teachers did not buy into what was going on, and we see part of the result of that is that you don't have the momentum to change it. So I would say a few things about this are important. First is, how do you engage educators in the actual work? So if you're rethinking school budgets, rethinking staffing, is there a way to get teachers around a table to think it through and figure out what will work in their context? So when we work with a school, it's not the district saying, here's your budget now, here's your new budget that we're imposing on you. It's, here's your budget. How can you rethink your use of it to create the kind of roles and structures that you're trying to create to give teacher leadership opportunity and so forth? It's teachers that make those hard decisions, not the district office. So that's one, is actually empowering people, not just engaging them, but actually giving them the power to make the decisions. Secondly, is making it worth it for educators. I think one of the things we've fallen down on so often is we assume rightly that educators are in it because they want to help kids. They want to be great teachers and improve the lives of kids, and that's going to be enough. But if there's not really anything in it for the teachers personally in the change, how is that going to be sustained over time when the leadership gets weak behind it? And so what if you actually created a labor market in districts where you could earn more money and advance in your career by taking on more leadership and helping other teachers get better, and that would be a different trajectory for you. Suddenly, that's a long-term prospect that you want to hold on to. You're not just going to throw that out because the political winds shift. No, this is my life. This is my career. I'm going to try to hang on to it. And so you're going to have much more buy-in. So those are two ideas: empower teachers and then actually give them some skin in the game.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of
Follow-up
course. Yeah,
question?
of course.
I'm just, when you talk about teachers being kind of isolated, not having paths, you also at the same time talk about administration growing.
Yes.
And there being more instructional aides. So it seems like there is a lot more staffing, and teachers have both people below them and people above them. What's different about that system than what you're describing as ideal? Because it seems like there's kind of, they are getting more people with them, they're getting instructional aides, and they have an opportunity to move into, there's more administrative roles, so they can potentially move into one of those, and there's more of those.
Let me just focus on one big difference, which is in law firms, the average managing partner in a law firm, and that's the person who's taken on the administrative responsibility for the law firm. The average managing partner practices law 1/3 of the time. 1/3 of the time they're with clients, they're trying cases, they're handling transactions, whatever kind of law it is. If you become an administrator in a school, you no longer teach. You no longer have that student contact. And so there's not an advancement path where you can continue to teach and move up and earn more.
Is that part of the problem, is that administrators don't teach? Because you frame it as kind of like teachers should be able to move into other roles, but I mean, in college, it's very common. When I went to the University of Oklahoma, president of our university, David Warren, taught a class every year. And administrators routinely used to teach in college. It's becoming more differentiated now, but is that part of the solution?
It could help. I don't know of any evidence on that, but you would think that if someone continues to teach, they're going to be more in touch with the challenges that the other teachers are facing, and also have more credibility as an advisor and a leader of a team of teachers, because they're in the middle of it themselves.
And to go on to special
Sure.
education, Nate?
So I think for being able to implement these kind of changes in special education, two thoughts. The first is the need for moral outrage. We are just surprisingly comfortable, particularly inside districts, or maybe as a sector, with the outcomes we currently have. There's almost an expectation, hey, these kids, well, of course they're not doing as well. They've got a disability. That kind of backdrop makes it really hard to generate the kind of support for the level of change that we need. So a healthy and sustained dose of moral outrage is, in fact, step one. The second, which I think builds a lot off of what Bryan said, you can't actually force this onto a system. Trust me, I've tried very unsuccessfully. The good news is that the special education teachers, the staff who are basically we're going to be asking to make a lot of these changes, they are voting with their feet. They really love kids and they hate their job. We have a special education teacher shortage in all 50 states, plus the District of Columbia, not to forget where we are today. They are leaving the profession in droves because this work is way too hard, not nearly rewarding enough, unsustainable. And the nice thing is, as districts that have tried to implement a lot of these best practices, you can do it in a way that we call playing to teachers' strengths. If I'm a special educator and I have strength in the IEP and compliance process, let me do that all day long. And if I have strength in teaching reading, which is such a valued skill, for God's sake, let me do that all day long. And don't have me spend a third of my day in meetings doing evaluations. And if I have no strength, interest, aptitude, or training in managing behaviors, don't make that a third of my day either. Because essentially, I had said that the core strategies of the past said one is we need a lot of adults. Correlating to that was a lot of adults doing, each adult does a lot of things. Reading, math, English, science, IEPs, compliance, law, meeting management, behavior support. That's way too much, and allowing folks to specialize as they're implementing these best practices, we've found that the teachers are saying, well, this is a way better job. Maybe I'll keep doing it for 30 years. So let's get mad, and then let's also make the work much better for staff. And that's going to be a path that will allow us to start to implement these kind of changes at scale.
Interesting. So Karen, your chapter talks about places where it's a little bit different. There's a catalyst that is causing sort of the need for these changes. And it's interesting because we talk about this a bit in the book in Mike McShane's chapter, who's on the next panel, that during the recession, certain school leaders sort of took the opportunity that the sort of difficult situation presented to make change happen, to affect change. So that's happening in all of these places, but it also could happen in more places soon, right? There's a lot of talk about the sort of record expansion of the economy sort of maybe coming to a close soon. So there could be another sort of economic downturn, in which case more of these opportunities would present themselves. So my question for you is, you've worked with a lot of places. Can you give some good examples of leaders taking the opportunity of declining enrollment to make these changes and sort of how they went about that, or sort of what other places could take from places that have done this successfully?
Yes, I love that question, and I think that, and I want to talk about the role that states can play in making that happen more often in a second. But so I'll share the example from Baltimore City right now, and Sonia Santelises was going to be here to talk with us. So happy to do that. So she came into the district knowing that it had been in a state of deficit, due in part because of declining enrollment, but many other issues as well. So huge deficit, and she knew that at the same time performance was unacceptably, shockingly low in the district. So she had the need both to make a big investment in improving performance and to close the deficit, and determined as soon as she went in that the first thing she would have to do was to engage the broader community in helping to figure this out. And so what she did, with our help, which is great, but is to really tell very clearly that story. What is driving the deficit? And it was a combination of things. Things in central office that were too high and needed to be reduced. Schools that were too small and needed to be cut. But also it was a combination of investments that they had committed to over time. Increases in teacher compensation, a commitment to pre-K, and so on. And so they were able to spell out that story and say, this is not the story that often gets told about deficits, which is that district leaders are perennially incompetent and can't get their act together. This is a story of costs that are rising and revenue that is flat or declining, in combination with commitments that we've made and that we also haven't kept in trying to match our deficit. The difference between the way she did this and the way that it often happens is that she involved the broader community in helping first to check the numbers, to get a real sense of what was going on, and then in helping to solve, to kind of think about the solutions. And she got lots of other folks involved in making that case. So, you know, a thing she would say when she went out to the community is, this is not me, Dr. Santelises, is telling you what to do about it. This is me sharing you the challenge and us figuring out together what to do about it. And in the end, she had folks going to the state and making the case not for a single-year solution, but for a multi-year solution, because the declining enrollment challenge is not a single-year kind of thing. It's something that has it takes place over a long period of time, and the performance improvement challenge the same. The result of going to state and having lots of folks do that was an initial commitment of $60 million a year for 3 years, which happened because Sonia and her team asked for $60 million, and her colleague, a businessman who'd been coming around to help, said, no, we need it for 3 years. And she's like, yes. So, I mean, it's the advantage of getting all sorts of folks doing that. So I think that, that this kind of approach comes from folks who take that role, who take those leadership roles, who already are sensitized to those issues. And so capacity building of leaders through their career is a critical part of this, is viewing, as you described with the special ed, the management of resources is a critical part of improving student performance, and having that as part of the mindset. The last thing I'll say is that states right now have a moment with ESSA legislation that lets states hold back 7% to support the lowest performing districts in thinking differently. And a lot of the solutions we've raised require transition funding, require moving out of the old ways of organizing and funneling money. What happens usually when you get more revenue, it flows straight into the existing teacher compensation system, and it's gone before you even thought about what the next thing to do is. And so states can leverage the moment with ESSA. There's a provision to do resource review allocations to actually support districts in taking this look with those resources, and they can put, like Bryan said, dollars in to support piloting new ways of organizing that, and infusing money in to do new things into these declining district places.
Interesting stuff. Interesting. Thank you. So now is a good time to turn it over to questions from the audience. We'll call on people who raise their hand. Just 2 quick rules. When we give you the mic, please state your name and affiliation. And please also ask a question. If you've been going on for too long and I don't see a question, I'll have to move on to somebody else. So with that, here in the front. Wait, hon, he's going to bring you a mic. Thanks.
Hi. Obviously, what Nathan said, fund what works. I'm sorry?
Your name and affiliation.
Oh, Mark
please.
Nadell. Question I have, and I've long believed what Bryan has been supporting about redeploying teachers, master teachers, just a whole new system, more total money to teachers. Question I have is the flip side of that. What works least? What we have to cut or shift funds from? Have we identified those things? And if we have, is there political resistance, or what is the resistance to shifting from those?
That could be a long answer. There's definitely political resistance. I mean, that's part of the challenge here, is that anything you do creates a constituency, whether it's employees of a district or whether it's people in the community that think this is the way things should go. And so changing from point A to point B is always going to be politically challenging as well as technically challenging. I think we've learned a lot about what doesn't work in the area of teacher support. I'll just focus on that one part because there's many things we could talk about. But I think we've learned that thinking of the principal as the primary instructional leader, even though that was a faddish concept, is a crazy idea, because the principal can't possibly support 30, 40, 50 teachers, especially if they're spread across content areas and whatever expertise that principal has. That's a foolish notion. I think we've also learned that instructional coaching with large spans is ineffective. So if you have many teachers that you have to support and you're maybe across many schools, you're never going to be able to spend the kind of time that you need to really help the teacher get better and better. And so I think if you look at these efforts in the past to say, let's have large numbers of teachers supported by a small number of people, that's proven to be not an effective way to raise teaching effectiveness. We need to think more in terms of small teams with a much more intimate relationship where they can spend a lot of time understanding each teacher's strengths and then support them more effectively. So that's one of many things that don't work that we could move on from. I'm sure there are others.
I'll add a simple one, which is about differentiation. Differentiation in ratios of class size, in time, and so on. Right now, everything is organized equal time, equal class sizes for subjects and grades, pretty much generally. A little bit of change over the career from elementary to not, but thinking much more strategically about what the group sizes students are in, and for what subjects, for how long, for what needs is really important. And then again, to Bryan's whole thing, thinking more strategically about how we compensate teachers. So we're differentiating there. So it's shifting from even distribution over all teachers and classes and subjects and grades to much more differentiation.
Let's find another question. Sure, yes.
Both of you mentioned changes that would cut the amount that goes to teachers. The 2/3 that doesn't go to teachers would have to go down if we're going to get to 50% for teachers. So what are the non-teacher stuff that is working less?
Well, I think one of the core shifts when it comes to special education is if we're going to give kids who struggle much more time with highly skilled classroom teachers, the thing you'll see the biggest reduction in is special education paraprofessionals. We have added a few 100,000 of them in the last decade or so. They have become a primary instructor for kids who struggle. They are not your best teachers because they're not teachers at all. And so you see districts reducing non-certified staff and investing all of that into highly skilled certified staff.
All right. The one, yeah.
Marianne McGrail, former board member of a charter school in Boston. Ms. Miles commented briefly on after-school programs. I wanted to ask the panel how effective in general those are and what percentage of the education budget goes to them.
Yeah, so I'll take it quickly and then you jump in. I mean, so we don't have a lot of spending in traditional district budgets on after-school programming. We've got some districts that offer extended day that's not necessarily done by partner providers in communities. And so we see that as an opportunity that charters are seizing much more often, is how do you integrate the activities that are happening after school with things that are, with the school day. How do you coordinate a broader set of partners in thinking about all the combined set of needs that students have? And we see that as an opportunity and have witnessed it in declining enrollment districts where they've actively gone out to the community and thought differently about, what is the school day? How can I expand it? How can I expand the school day or learning time to go from 7:30 to 5, stitching together a combination of partners and resources and all of that. So I see that as a huge and unexplored opportunity in these cases, and the cost pressure as being one way to unlock some of that.
Okay. Does anybody have a question for Adam?
All the hands go down. It's all right.
Mike?
Why are you doing this to me, Brandon?
Sure, Adam can take this one. Hey, everybody, Mike Petrilli at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute.
He's only the guy who signs my paycheck.
Yes, exactly.
Mine.
First of all, thank you, Rick, and your whole team for putting this on and for being such great partners as well. This is super fun and great panel. Let me ask a provocative question. It's easy for us to start talking in ways that feel a little technocratic. Let's just do this instead of that. Isn't it true that part of what's happening here is that there is a conflict between some things schools might do that could be more efficient and some things that we don't do because of concerns around equity, and that maybe we should rethink some of those things? So, for example, we say, well, teachers can only handle so many kids in a given classroom because we're going to assume that classroom is very heterogeneous in terms of ability level, because we've been convinced that grouping kids by ability or tracking, anything that looks like tracking, is not okay, in the cause of equity. Or, teachers can only handle so many kids in the classroom because we're going to assume that a couple of the kids in every class are going to be pretty disruptive, and we now have this attitude we don't want to suspend anybody, or, we're trying to do these different ways of discipline. And maybe if we rethought that, again, we could do things in more efficient ways. So I guess I just want to push on that. Like, have we basically done this to ourselves because of these impulses around equity over the last 50 years? And that's some of these things we need to maybe rethink. Easy question.
Anybody want to take it?
Well, I don't think that they're always in conflict. I don't think that this is always a trade-off. And so I think that people do things for a lot of stated reasons, but programs that differentiate learning I don't think are necessarily bad for equity. I think that there's students of every demographic group that are high ability and that will benefit from programs like that. And so the idea that, I guess I would say that from my look at this, I don't think that it's always a trade-off, but maybe the other panels have other ideas.
Yeah.
And one thing I would say is just, I don't think there's any case to be made that we've overdone it on equity. I mean, the achievement gaps are
Right.
huge. They haven't closed. We may have done some specific strategies that are not the right solution for equity, but I don't want to say we've tipped too much away from efficiency toward equity because there's such huge need for change there. However, I do think we shouldn't regard anything as a sacred cow when it comes to how we work in schools. And if something is being done because it's politically correct or because we have a general notion about it, we should examine that pretty hard. I think you're making a great suggestion on that front.
Yeah, I so agree with that. And I do think, though, and we're doing a lot of message testing in our work to try to understand how can we talk about equity in ways that will galvanize folks around it and not push people away from engaging in how we make schools better. And one of the things we find over and over again is that equity, for many people, it translates into lowering the bar, which I think is a little bit what you were referring to, for everybody, so we make sure that everyone has an equitable or an equal experience. And so part of the challenge that district leaders and policymakers have, I think, is how to make that case that it's about raising the performance level for everyone. I mean, 50% of our 8th graders can read, are proficient or above anyway. So we're just not getting it done anyway. So, and about the equity. So I think the question is how do we collectively get better about talking about how we help everyone get up to that level? And to your point about differentiating these strategies for high performance, teachers working in teams, responding to the needs of kids right at the moment, pulling in the special ed piece and getting early intervention. Those things are good for everyone, and thinking about how we intensify that for all kids is a great strategy too. So I think and skill-based grouping and all of those things, those are strategies good for everyone, so long as we're figuring out how to talk about both excellence and equity at once.
Again, I think about equity a little bit differently when it comes to special education. Because this idea of differentiated spending, which is often a corollary to equity, kids with a greater need greater resources. I think if we moved away from it, and this is a crazy thing to say for a conference on spending, but if we thought about equity as talent and not dollars. If I'm a student who struggles, I'm a student with special needs, I am so much more likely you will spend 2 or 3 times more on me than if I didn't. But, so that could say, hey, we're being more equitable by differentiating, but I will spend so much less time as a student with a disability with a highly skilled teacher.
Yeah.
I'll have a paraprofessional for 20-30% of my day as an instructor. When I go out for extra help, I'm likely to be taught reading or math by somebody who's not highly skilled in reading or math. So if we recast equity as access to really skilled teachers, we aren't doing nearly enough for kids with disabilities, whereas if we look at it purely in dollars and cents, you could say, hey, maybe I'm getting my fair share, which is a much larger share, but it clearly hasn't led to the results we want.
We have time for one more very, very quick question. There. Margarita coming in.
Hi, Leah Cruzy, Allies for Educational Equity. My question is around factors beyond the superintendent's control, understanding the superintendent derives her authority from the school board, whoever appoints her there, so that's kind of limited there. But the two areas here, one are legacy costs, like pension, and then the other are in thousands and thousands of school districts around the country that are very, very small, and it might actually make more sense to consolidate, but that's politically fought. So spending dollars more wisely in contexts where there are factors beyond that superintendent's control, knowing that superintendent it has her authority derived from a body outside of herself.
That's the question.
It's a great question. I think we're going to be talking about pensions a lot in the next session. So maybe and I know you've done work on small districts. I mean, so again, beyond your control, I think one of the things that we all do with our leaders is to say, the things are beyond your control, you're making transparent so folks can help you understand. On the small district piece, again, the largest costs are driven by small schools. So there's a lot of opportunity, even within small districts, to think differently about the delivery mechanisms that are used, especially with technology now. There are a lot of opportunities to do remote classrooms and so on. So I'm always focusing on what are the things your job is to focus on the policies that can help surround and enable from your organization, is to think about those policies. And what we work on is supporting small district leaders to push the bounds of what they can do around their delivery models, to consolidate and reconfigure school areas, and to push on the state to support transition funds to do those different things. So,
And one specific thing states could really focus on is making it more possible for teachers and teacher leaders to be shared across small districts, because there's no way every small district in the country is going to have a great calculus teacher in any time frame. And so how could that be done with remotely located people who are shared or circuit riding in some way? And states could facilitate that and make it easier for districts to do.
It's a good stopping point. That's all our time for panel 1. We're going to take a 10-minute break. If you want to stay for panel 2 and 3, you'll have opportunities to ask questions then. There are drinks and food outside. If you could give our great panelists a round of applause.